Are there any journalists that work in the Bay Area? All right. What any publications that I would know?
Yeah, a fair amount of them. Conical or Silent Journal.
I've heard of those. Yeah. All right. Good. All right. So I have to be careful what I say, so it doesn't get back to all my people. Berkeley is just so you get a good context of where Berkeley is. San Francisco East Bay, so just across the bay from the city of San Francisco, just north of the city of Oakland. We have about 115,000 people, but we're growing really rapidly. We've grown about 10% in the last 10 years, and we're expected to grow by about another 25% by the year 2040. So we're growing up. And a lot of that growth is happening because of stories that you probably hear a lot about the Bay Area, is the cost of living. And access to affordable housing, especially in San Francisco, is very difficult. And so people tend to migrate eastward into Berkeley, and now beyond Berkeley into Oakland and Richmond and cities throughout the East Bay. And I say that not just so you have a little bit of information about Berkeley, but that also has significant implications for transportation and how far people have to drive to meet their mobility needs, to drive to work or drop their kids at school or drive to the store. It has major implications where people live, how far they have to drive to meet their needs. And that's one of our challenges in the Bay Area. With the price of housing going skyrocketing in the urban core, people are having to move further and further out, and it becomes much more difficult to enable people to live closer to where they work and close to where they shop and where they recreate. So that's a challenge that we're working on in the Bay Area across all the cities and counties and the regional agencies. I'm an assistant to the city manager. I'm also the city's first chief resilience officer. And when you have the word resilience in your title, you tend to have to think a lot about what resilience means. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what resilience means from the perspective of a local government person, from a practitioner, a project manager, a program implementer, a policymaker at a city. Have you guys heard from any cities today yet, or am I the first? I'm the first. Oh, a few. Okay. You guys don't even know. What have you been doing? So I'll talk a little bit about what resilience means from the perspective of a local government, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of our resilience priorities are in the city of Berkeley. Resilience is this word that you've probably heard lots of times today, and even before today, getting bounced around in all kinds of different contexts and settings. And depending on who you ask, you might get a little bit of a different definition for what resilience means. You might have even heard a few different definitions today, or heard people using resilience in different ways today. So some people really associate resilience with disaster preparedness. And a resilient community is one that's maybe prepared for the next earthquake or the tornado or the hurricane. And there's a strong connection to disasters when people use that term. But you also start to hear resilience in the context of climate quite a bit now. And you hear climate resilience, a community that's prepared for the impacts of climate change. Resilience is also used in the context of social concerns. Social resilience might mean a community that is working to improve residents' access to public health or residents' access to affordable housing. And you might also hear resilience in the context of the local economy or the economy in general. And a resilient economy is an economy that maybe is diverse, has a mix of small, medium, and large-sized businesses doing a diverse set of things and providing a diverse set of services. So it can be confusing to figure out what resilience means because it's used in lots of different ways. From my perspective, as someone who works at a city, each one of those contexts is a component of this term of resilience, but no one of those alone constitutes a resilient community. Resilience is not just about preparing for one type of shock, like a natural disaster, or one type of slow-moving stress, like an economic downturn or like lack of affordable housing. Resilience is about designing integrated solutions that prepare your community for a whole different range of shocks and stresses that your community might experience. So what that looks like for me and what that looks like practically on the ground to people that are designing policies and programs in cities, what that means is you design your programs and your policies to create as many co-benefits as possible and to bring as many different stakeholders to the table at the same time, right? There's no one thing that I can do that's going to solve all of my city's challenges. There's no one thing that I can do that's going to better prepare us for earthquakes, an economic downturn, sea level rise, extreme heat, lack of affordable housing, all of those challenges that all of us face as communities. There's no one action I can take, right? And so that's not the point of working on resilience. The point of working to advance resilience is to take actions that hit as many of those things at once as possible. And that's kind of my goal and my job as Chief Resilience Officer, is to help our community design strategies that help us prepare for a whole range of different shocks and stresses, create as many benefits as possible for our community, and engage as many stakeholders as possible at the same time. And that's really what local government action is all about. Before I was the Chief Resilience Officer, and before resilience was the buzzword that you hear everywhere, and there's panels on resilience, there's books on resilience, there's everything, there's probably candy called resilience. Before that happened, local governments were on the ground trying to bring people together, enlarge the table where people can engage to design programs and policies, and design strategies that have many different co-benefits. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean so you have some additional context. Berkeley, like many cities, has a really aging stormwater infrastructure, stormwater system. We have about 100 miles of stormwater pipes in Berkeley, and that system is about 100 years old, okay? So our stormwater system is deteriorating. And if you ask any city about their stormwater system, you'll probably get a pretty similar story, right? These are old systems that cost a lot of money to maintain, okay? So already, because of our degrading stormwater system, we have issues with flooding, even in a moderate storm, right? So then you layer on top of that existing challenge that cities face, that infrastructure challenge, and you layer on top of that the impacts of climate change. And we're a coastal city, and so we're starting to see sea level rise. The San Francisco Bay has increased 7 inches over the past 100 years. We expect at least another 12 inches by 2050, another 36 inches by 2100. That's just sea level rise. And if you put on top of that storm surge, then we're talking about 50, 60, 70 inches of inundation in our city. And that has major implications. As someone who works in that community, who lives in that community, has major implications about where we're going to invest, how we're going to protect households and businesses. So we have this existing system that's already falling apart, frankly. And now you've got this other stress on top of it, sea level rise. And then you also have precipitation. And we're not getting much precipitation lately in the Bay Area and California, unfortunately. But the problem is that when it does rain, it rains harder. And so we're having more extreme storms. So you have this confluence of challenges, and the result is flooding. And we have intersections in our city that are routinely flooded in moderate storms. We have households that are affected. Some of our oldest businesses are affected. And this impact, like many other climate impacts, tends to affect certain people in our community way more than it affects others. And so most of the flooding in Berkeley tends to happen and be concentrated in West Berkeley along the coast of the Bay. And that's also where more of our low-income housing is and some of where our oldest anchor institutions are. So those folks are being disproportionately affected by that impact. So if you look at that from a resilience lens, if you look at that through a resilience lens, there's lots of things happening there that are affecting our community. So how do you start addressing that? A conventional way to address flooding and deal with stormwater, get it out to the bay in our case, is to build a bigger pipe or a series of bigger pipes that take water and they flow it out into the bay. And that's what we've been doing for tens and hundreds of years. Right? That's sort of the conventional tried and true way. You take some of that volume and you shoot it down pipes and you let gravity take it out to wherever it's going to go. And that solution has merit still in a lot of different cases. It has a lot of merit, and it's the right thing to do. But that solution really creates a narrow set of benefits, and it really just solves for one problem, and that's flooding. So if I'm looking at that same challenge through a resilience lens at the local government level, you start to ask the question: how can I do things differently that might create a different set of benefits while still dealing with flooding, right? And so then you start to look at green infrastructure type solutions. And when I talk about green infrastructure, I mean solutions that tend to mimic ecological systems, like rain gardens that can slow water, capture stormwater, filter stormwater before it goes into the stormwater system or dissipates into the groundwater aquifers, permeable pavement systems that again deal with the volume of stormwater and can filter some of the pollutants out of it. Cisterns that can capture stormwater and use that stormwater for other purposes like irrigation or fire suppression. So if you compare that type of solution, a green infrastructure solution, to a pipe, they're still dealing with flooding, but they're dealing with that in a completely different way. On the green infrastructure side of things, you're creating more than one benefit. You're taking pollutants out of the stormwater, you're dealing with stormwater volume, and you're beautifying your community, right? That is an example of what resilience looks like on the ground. And sometimes it's hard to sort of apply resilience on a local level and actually figure out what exactly are we talking about. That's what it means. It means applying a multi-benefit, multi-stakeholder solution on the ground to address a problem. So that's an example, okay? Another example, maybe from the energy world. We saw with Hurricane Sandy that we had cities along the East Coast that were without power for 10 days, 2 weeks or more, right? So you had the hurricane, which creates its own set of impacts, and then you had no power, which creates its own set of cascading impacts. It's harder to deliver basic services and care to people that were affected by the disaster without electricity, right? So again, here, there's a problem, right, that many cities face. In Berkeley, I'm very concerned about this problem, and looking at Sandy, looking at Katrina. And I know that the earthquake in the Bay Area is going to happen. I know we will get a major earthquake on the Hayward Fault that runs right through my city. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. And when that happens, there's going to be a whole set of impacts. One of them is going to be loss of power. Traditionally, the way that a local government would deal with power, providing backup power, is a generator. In our case, a diesel generator, and you hook it up to a building. When that building loses power, there's a backup set of power associated with that generator, okay? That's a conventional solution that has its benefits and definitely has its place. But again, if we're looking at this same problem through a resilience lens, you start to think about, okay, how can I come up with a solution that maybe has benefits that are a little bit less narrow, broader, multi-benefit solutions? So what we're pursuing now in Berkeley is this concept of microgrids, which maybe you've heard about, right? So a microgrid essentially enables an entity to take a building or a set of buildings and island them from the main grid, the macro grid, so that a building or a set of buildings can operate independently of the main grid when the main grid is disrupted. Essentially what you're doing is you're creating a little mini grid, a microgrid, with other forms of distributed power like solar and battery storage and maybe generators. The main grid goes down during an earthquake, the microgrid can stay running. Okay, so you're solving for the same problem, you've got backup power, but you're doing it in a completely different way. You're creating clean energy through solar and battery storage, so you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You can use a microgrid to reduce the amount of power at the peak demand periods that a building is consuming, so you're saving money. So you're enabling the building to use power from a battery instead of from the main grid at the times when electricity is at its most expensive. And so that building is saving money in the way that it consumes electricity, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing energy efficiency, providing backup power. Now compare that solution again to a diesel generator. And those are very different approaches to solving the same problem. And also think about the people that solution brings to the table versus a diesel generator, right? A diesel generator brings the engineer. A microgrid brings private sector investors that want their products to be commercialized, solar providers, battery providers, people like Tesla. The engineers are at the table, the enviros are at the table. And where you put these microgrids has implications on how prepared you are for different events. So we're focusing our microgrid effort on our emergency shelters, the facilities that are going to have to serve the displaced and vulnerable people in the event of a disaster, right? And so when you do that, you bring a whole other set of people to the table, the folks that are worried about housing issues and disaster and care and shelter issues. So it's a much broader, wider table that you create when you sort of look at that same problem through a resilience lens. Again, very different challenges. Am I at time? So I think those are two, I hope, pretty tangible examples of what resilience looks like to someone like me. There's a lot of cities that are doing this work. The position that I have, Chief Resilience Officer, was really set in motion through a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation. And the Rockefeller Foundation is funding 100 cities around the globe. It's called the 100 Resilient Cities Initiative. Berkeley was one of the first 30-ish. To do work that I do. And the resilience officers around the world have all different sets of areas of focus. I tend to focus on sustainability and climate and earthquake preparedness because that's my context. But resilience officers around the globe are doing all different types of different work. And Rockefeller Foundation is really trying to create a practice around the world of cities that are looking very comprehensively and looking in a very multi-benefit, multi-stakeholder way at how you deal with many of the challenges that we're facing and that are really going to have to continue to face as climate change accelerates and progresses. So I think I'm out of time, so I'll stop there, but I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you.